so I know that.
I can hear you.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it's a really sunny day. We'd probably rather be outside in the garden, but hopefully it's going to be worth it. I'm just going to mute everyone because I can hear a few people at the moment. So actually, because I can't work out how to do that, do you mind just muting yourselves if you're not on mute? Perfect. Thank you. Great. So today we're going to cover AQA English Language and how to achieve top grade marks. And just so you know that the way I've come about this sort of formula and some of the tips I'm going to be talking about, I've interviewed probably about a dozen examiners who are official AQA examiners and run a focus group. Tried to work out with them what are the common mistakes that are made, what are things that aren't perhaps taught at school, what things that come up, and hopefully I can address and remedy those. So I'm going to cover the basics first off. So a lot of students don't realise that GCSE. Sorry, I can still hear someone. Do you mind muting? Hello? Thank you. So a lot of students don't realise that GCSE language is actually a separate qualification to literature. And even top grade students, when I tutor, sometimes it'll be a week before the exam and they'll sort of get their literature and language jumbled up. So that's a key thing to remember. It's a separate qualification you can revise for. Paper 1 is 50% of your grade for that qualification. So half your GCSE is paper 1 and the other half of your GCSE is paper 2, which is writer's viewpoints and perspectives. Hopefully you know that, but just to drum that in. So the focus today is about the optimum distribution of the marks and how the marks are awarded, and then how to distribute your time in the exam in both papers, and how to distribute your skills as well to make sure that you're not putting the skills in the wrong place so then you miss out on marks. So those are the three things that we're going to cover today. And I did send a note out. Hopefully you've all got a copy of the the practice papers that are on the Path My English website. If you don't have that to hand, any practice paper will do. We're just going to be going over the types of questions that come up. So firstly, the distribution of marks. Some of you are going to know this already, but paper 1 is half the marks and split into two, section A and section B. Section A, the first 40 marks is distributed as on the screen. So question 1 is 4 marks, question 2 is 8 marks, as is question 3. Question 4 is 20 marks. And section B is the meaty one. That's 40 marks, and that's a quarter of your whole GCSE grade in one question. So it's really important that, and we'll go on to timings, that you make sure that you split your timings correctly. Paper 2 is similar structure, really. Question 1, again, is 4 marks. So don't spend too much time on the earlier questions. Question 2 is 8 marks, and 12 marks, 16 marks for question 4. And again, section B is another 40 mark question. So it's a very similar structure for paper 1 and paper 2. So the timings are relatively similar, which we'll go on to. But just looking at the way that those marks are apportioned, you can see that if this triangle is the amount of time you need to spend on each question, you need to be spending more and more time on each question as the paper goes on. So lots of students make the mistake of firstly running out of time, but they often do that because they just spend so much time on these smaller questions, which is not a good use of time. You know, if you can only get a maximum of 8 marks on a question, do it well, but not if it means it's going to eat up at your time at the end for section B. You might already know that. I might be telling you something really obvious, but it's really, really worth keeping all of those marks in mind because the paper is actually quite formulaic. It has to be fairly formulaic because the marking of it needs to be consistent. And so there is a marking palette and a mark scheme, as you're going to be aware of. And so I think halfway to getting a good mark before you really start revising the skills is just knowing the formula of the paper and how they're laid out and really just understanding so you can milestone your revision and your exam time. So on to timings now. So paper 1 is 1 hour and 45 minutes. And it's really neat for you to remember is just 1 hour on part A and 45 minutes on part B. Same thing for paper 2 as well. 1 hour part A, 45 minutes part B. So when you've passed that hour mark and you're looking at that clock regularly in your exam, you know that it's time to move on because, as I say, section B for both papers is 25% of your whole GCSE marks. So and that's where people go wrong. You know, it's very easy, really. Questions 1, 2, and 3 particularly are kind of easy in section A. So just make sure at that 1 hour mark, time to move on to section B, because you've got 25% of your GCSE mark at stake for that one question. So part A, paper 1 first. This is how we're going to distribute your time for that full hour. So you're going to, first off, when you see your paper, you're going to spend 10 minutes reading the extract, reading the text that's in front of you. 10 minutes, and highlight it as well. Make sure you go to your exam with highlighters and pens, and so you can scribble all over it. Anything that kind of comes to mind as you read it can be really useful when you go back. So if you're reading something and there's a particular section that's quite sad or sympathetic, you know, write those initial thoughts down, because quite often your first impressions of the text are the most useful, and that gets lost later on when you go to the detailed analysis. So any ideas that come to you straight away, scribble down as you're reading in that 10 minutes. Question 2, it's only a 4-minute question. It's very easy, should be very easy. Just spend 5 minutes maximum on that. You should be able to do that in just 2-3 minutes. Question 2, the 8 marker, again, that's another 10 minutes. Question 3, 8 marker, again, another 10 minutes, and leave yourself enough time. So that's 25 minutes for question 4. So then you're apportioning time proportionately to the marks, which again sounds like common sense, but you need to have this image sort of engraved in your brain. And when you look at the clock in your exam, you're looking at these different questions as you go around. And then obviously question part B is 45 minutes. So again, 10 minutes planning. It's really important you plan for part B. I'll show you how to properly plan later on in this session. Once you spent 10 minutes planning, you have half an hour of writing furiously, and then 5 minutes at the end to check. And because there's a lot of marks available for your spelling and grammar, you will need that 5 minutes. That's why it's really important to never run out of time in the exam, because again, that is usually the difference between an 8 and a 9 mark, or an A and an A star. It's just people running out of time. It's just organization. It's not intelligence. It's not how prepared they've been in their revision. It's often time management. And so just make sure that if you are a top grade student, you get your grade that you deserve by being organized with your time. Leave 5 minutes at the end for checking. Part A of paper 2, that's similar. But the only difference here is do 10 minutes reading, 5 minutes again, question 1, which is looking for the answers, and 10 minutes question 2. Leave yourself 15 minutes for question 3, it's a bit more, and 20 minutes question 4. I'll leave these notes up, by the way, on the slide, so you can print these out as part of your revision, put them on the wall, because I really do want you to make sure that you absorb these timings into your brain before the exam. And part B, again, it's the same as paper 1, 10 minutes planning. Really important to plan your answers for part B. I can't emphasize the importance enough of planning. I know teachers will also, but quite often students just don't know how to plan. So I'll go on to that later on, but you must use that 10 minutes of planning. Half an hour of writing. A good exam answer usually only takes about 25 minutes to write in part B. But again, if you properly plan it and you properly check it, that's the only use of your time for the writing. And 5 minutes at the end to check your answer. Before we go on, has anyone got any questions on the timing element before we move on to skills? No, great. We're going to press on to skills. So part 1, section A, that's your assessment objective 1, is finding 4 facts. So if you get your practice paper in front of you now, I'm going to get mine on my iPad. Just because I can't flick between the 2 screens very well on Zoom. So if you've got your practice paper in front of you, so you can follow as we're going along. So it should look like that. And question 1 is this one here. So if you get those in front of you, either a hard copy or on screen, and you just need to find the 4 facts that the question asks you to find. You don't get any marks for finding the most obscure. So save yourself time, go for the most obvious. This is just testing your reading skills in this one. So go for the most obvious ones you can find, and only from the lines referenced. So the question in the set A paper says from lines 1 to 4. Another thing that students go wrong is that they will answer from different parts of the extract, and make sure it's only from the lines that's mentioned in the question. Question 2, that's AO2 objectives. That's explaining, commenting, and analyzing on language. So this is your close analysis, your critical analysis. And so you really need to revise your terminology. And on the website, I'll be posting up a full glossary of terms for writers' methods, and make sure you know all of those inside out. And it's not so much to use them as a sort of terminology bingo in your exams. Examiners spot that a mile off, and they get quite irritated by it when people use things like hyperbole just for the sake of it, without explaining why writers used it or really putting it in proper context. So make sure you know your terminology. So first off, thinking about positive and negative connotations of the text. Talk about incongruity. That's really important as well. So if a description is incongruous, or they're using a comparison that's kind of incongruous or unusual, mention that. Semantic fields, pathetic fallacy, all of those kind of things that you're going to have as a glossary printed on your wall. You're going to remember them, you're going to memorize them with flashcards inside out. All of that will be put on the website. So I won't go into detail in the particular terminology terms now, but you can revise them later. Sentence types was really important for this question as well, and talk about simple sentences, compound, fragmented sentences. If you want to get that A star, don't just write short sentences, long sentences. But what's really important is the what, how, and why. Sorry about the spelling mistake there. What, how, and why that writer has used that method. So, for instance, if the writer has used incongruity or pathetic fallacy, why? Why have they done that? And it's usually to make you feel something. That's the effect on you. Is usually your emotions. Almost all writing, in fact, is about feelings and emotions. And again, when it comes to revision, I'd try to memorize every emotion possible, try to list them out on a piece of paper. So don't just go fully, there's a semantic field of sadness, for instance, really specifying, go into nuanced emotions, things like grief or anxiety. To know your emotions inside out, you should have a whole list of emotions before you go in. So that when you're talking about the writer's effect, you can talk about the effect it has on the reader, those terms. And associated meanings as well. If there is ambiguity, talk about that. Sometimes a text might even allude to some sort of Greek myth that you might know. It's definitely worth mentioning that. Sometimes that is on the mark scheme as well, as if students pick up on things like fairy tale motifs or mythology. So if you see associated meaning, definitely mention that there, because it shows that you have a certain amount of cultural capital, which can be important for this exam. Sounds as well. Don't forget about the sounds of the language that the writer's chosen for this question. So if there's consonants and hard sounds, why? What effect does that have? Does that create aggression? Does it create anger? Does it say something about the characters in that extract? So think about the sounds of the language. But how does your points link to the overall meaning of the text? That's really important as well. So when you are making a point, make sure that you have an overarching thesis as well. Question 3, that's the same learning objective, AO2, to explain, comment, and analyze. But this time, instead of language, we're analyzing the structure. And a lot of students just don't know how to do that. There'll be separate revision resources on the website for structure, but one really important thing is to remember to comment on the piece as a whole, not just individual pieces and sections. Make sure you analyze also the relationship between any internal thoughts and feelings of a character to external action. So for instance, in this example, practice paper, the character's in a taxi and she's very, very anxious. And as the taxi is going along the road, it's sort of bumping along. And so make sure that you link that. So the external action is very bumpy, it's uncertain terrain of the road, and that mirrors the anxieties and uncertainties that she has internally, psychologically. And so just link that internal thoughts, especially if it's first person narration, between what else is happening outside in the outside world. Explain also how the writer starts, ends, and develops the story. It might be a complete short story you get or an extract, but there should be some sort of disruption somewhere. So mention that as part of the structure. We'll go on to plot later on when we're talking about narrative writing, but that is a fundamental part of any development of a narrative or a story. It's in 3 parts: the beginning, the middle, and end. If you've ever been to my narrative writing masterclass, you'll know the posh terms, the technical terms for those are the equilibrium, the disequilibrium, and the new equilibrium. You don't necessarily need to know those posh terms, but they can be quite useful, particularly when it's spotting the disequilibrium in a narrative, the disruption in a narrative, something where a normal life for character goes off track. And so if that happens, if that's in the extract that you're given in the exam, discuss the point of disruption in the story, because that's important in terms of your structure. And perspective shifts as well, that could be very important, because particularly if you're writing about the way a character is perceived by somebody else. So in this extract, there's a receptionist that isn't very nice to our main character, Mrs. Palfrey, and there's a shift in perspective about the receptionist's body language and the language she uses, and that's important as well, to shift perspectives to see different character point of views. And quite often there'll be a flashback as well. It'll either be a detailed flashback, or it'll just be an anecdote that the character has from a previous life or something. Now that's usually the equilibrium part, like I was talking about, the normality, the flashback to normal life for that character. And that's important in terms of the structure, because it might be that you're seeing the character at the disequilibrium, at the point of their life being disrupted. That's the start of the piece, the extract, and then it flashes back to that character's past life, the normal life, the equilibrium, and then it goes on to the new equilibrium, to see this character's new normal, their new version of normal for their life. So if there are any flashbacks, mention that as part of this question on structure. Question 4, that's your AO4 learning objective. That's where you've got to refer to specific quotes to evaluate and judge the writer's methods and their impact. So try and include a personal opinion if you can in this part. And what I've done is I've created a checklist with examiners for the more meaty questions, the ones with the larger marks. I've created a checklist, and again that will be on the website, and it's just really good when you practice a paper that you almost tick these off, certainly when you're marking it yourself, but when you're writing a paper, just remember to do this. So things like, I've begun with a sophisticated thesis or an argument about the text. So when you look at the example answer on the website, it does that. It starts off the sentence with a very clear argument about the text. So make sure you do that. Make sure you structure your paragraph, PQAC, so make sure that you have enough analysis in there. And again, when it talks about the effects of language, do not forget that. That's your what, how, and why. A lot of students will say, for instance, the writer uses hyperbole. First off, that's not a point. You're not making a point there. That's a writer method. The writer uses hyperbole to ... Then that's your what. And your how is usually your methods as well. So then that would talk about your sounds, but the why is really important. What, how, and why. Why has the writer bothered to do that? Why have they put those words on the page? What do they want to make you feel? And that's again where your list of emotions really comes in, because you'll be able to say the connotations of, or the semantic field of a text infers whatever feeling, or generates a particular feeling for the reader. Go back to the question as well in your comments. At the end of each paragraph, make sure you go back to it so that there's a common thread that's going through your answer. And quote from the text several times. Make sure it's in every paragraph you're quoting from the text. And again, on all the emotions. Now, POSJAM, if you've not come across that before, that stands for personification, onomatopoeia, simile, hyperbole, juxtaposition, alliteration, and metaphor. There are lots of other acronyms that you can use. Some I'll be posting on the website, but make sure you use terminology. Again, not just for the sake of it to use it, but to make sure that it's part of your sophisticated thesis of the text. Make sure that you have some alternative interpretations as well, and say which one's more convincing. So for instance, in this extract, there could be an alternative interpretation that perhaps the characters perhaps in a care home and is suffering from either Alzheimer's or something. That could be an interpretation that she's been taken there against her will. It's just good to kind of introduce other interpretations of the text to try and get a more unique original answer, because that's again what lots of examiners say, is that students tend to write very formulaic answers that all seem alike. So try and make yours a bit different by having an alternative argument. And make sure you finish it off with your clear point of view as well of a quote. And that's really important because a lot of students, where they're rushing to try and get on to the next question, they don't properly finish off their answer. That's really important. Now, when it comes to part B, this is really important that you prepare for this. So you've got to, AO5, communicate clearly, effectively, and imaginatively, and use a range of vocab and sentence structures. So if you go to your paper now, and you go to question 5, and that's where you have to either describe a remote house or write a story about an old woman. Now, the narrative ones, I think are more easy to do, and they tend to be more interesting answers as well. So I tend to advise my students to go for the narrative. It's up to them, obviously, but I find it's much more easier to prepare for it. So with this part of the exam, I think you can't really revise, but you can definitely prepare. And if you've been to my narrative writing masterclasses, I've got one next week, or just go on the website and look at the tutorials, because this is a creative writing question. So you're writing a story. So the worst thing a student can do, I think, for this part of the exam is to go in with no ideas and to try and write a story on the spot. And they're doomed to not fail, but they probably won't get a good mark. The best students go in with a bank of ideas that they've got. So they'll have, for instance, 5 objects, 5 characters, and 5 settings that they are going to have in their sort of toolbox before they even go into the exam. And then when you have a question like this, write a story about an old woman, it might be that actually one of the characters you prepared happens to be an old woman. So you've got her already fully fleshed out, and you know exactly who she is. And then you can create a narrative, a plot for her in the exam. You might already have one pre-written, but the most important thing is to make sure you stick to the theme. Again, a lot of examiners are all agreed that quite often they'll read pretty much a pre-written piece that a student has written before the exam and thought, oh, I'll pretend I've come up with this on the spot. They can spot it a mile off. And if you stuck to the theme, great, good for you, you got away with it. But quite often students try to shoehorn that into a theme, and then they lose marks because it's irrelevant. The other thing is to write what you know. Some examiners say that they have lots that are about kidnappings, bank robberies. I've also read quite a lot of exam papers from students, and for some reason they like to base their stories and their characters in New York. And then it's quite obvious from reading that they've never been to New York, and I have no idea why they do that. But I think it's because they think it's more exciting, but actually the best answers tend to be when you write what you know, because you're going to know all of the details, the intricate details, all the senses, the smells, the sights of that particular scene, particularly if it's about a person as well. Don't write about a particular type of person if you've never met them or you don't know much about it. Another one I had recently was, and it was a very good piece of writing. It was about a catwalk. It was a sort of a fashion event, and it was a very, very good piece of writing. But what was you could tell was that the student had never either been to one or never really doesn't really know what happens there. So the key details that were missing. So again, stick to what you know. Make sure that your ideas bank inside out. So you should have, before you go into the exam, revision cards with your characters, your objects, and your settings on. So ideally aim for 5. Maybe you can get away with 3, but I'll try and have 5 different characters, different scenes, and different objects. And then you can start with the objects usually. And so just say if the story is to write about a train station, for instance. If one of your objects happens to be a suitcase or a handbag or a diary, great, you're halfway there to starting a story. Well, why is it there in the first place? Has it been deliberately left? What's going on? So again, don't start creating ideas in the exam hall. Make sure you're convincing, realistic, and original. That's what the mark scheme wants you to be. Original, hopefully with your ideas bank, it will be original, but realistic. Again, a lot of students sort of lose their way on this one. They think by writing a detailed piece, it needs to be over the top and far-fetched. Don't. If you stick to what you know, for instance, the best stories can sometimes happen in a car traffic jam, for instance, in a very, very or normal setting. What's interesting then is the plot. What is going to happen? What kind of revelation are you going to have? But just be realistic with that one. Make sure you're entertaining as well. Imagine you've got this poor examiner who's going through stacks of papers. A lot of them are quite boring. A lot of the stories are quite boring, or the descriptions are slightly boring, I'm afraid to say. This is from their mouths, not mine, but they have said that they do find this one a bit of a struggle because some of them are quite boring. So entertain them, make sure it's enjoyable to read. Make sure you use imaginative comparisons as well. And really key is to make sure you have a beginning, middle, and end. Like I was talking about earlier with the equilibrium, disequilibrium, most students actually, not just some, most students don't actually focus on the new equilibrium. How does the story end? What is the new version of normal like for your characters? So for instance, they've left a suitcase in an airport, for instance. You've discovered that there's been a kidnap if you're going to go down that route. How does that end? What happens? What's the revolution and the resolution for it? A lot of students just say, oh, I'm going to leave it open-ended, open to interpretation. I don't really care about the ending, and if it's that open, it needs to have some sort of resolution. The other thing is, if you've left in 5 minutes, make sure you've checked your answer properly, because you can write a great story, but if you have too many spelling mistakes, for instance, you'll lose a whole grade for it potentially. And be ambitious with your vocabulary, but now these are some examiner tips when it comes to your vocabulary. Make sure it's not just for the hell of it. So we're going to rattle through these now, but again, stick to the familiar. Was all of them in this focus group I had with examiners. That was the key thing that they were all saying. Don't write about something you don't know. Also for part B, they were saying don't use dialogue. If you have a teacher who teaches you how to write dialogue brilliantly, great, use dialogue, but make sure you punctuate it correctly. Make sure you have speech marks in there. Make sure you set out the dialogue, pieces of dialogue on a fresh line, because examiners will mark you down for that sort of thing. They also, this is a new one to me, but they also hate it when a story ends up being a dream. Apparently that's lots of students write that, and that tends to indicate they're a sort of a C or at best a B level student, because it's a cop out. It goes back to what I was saying. Make sure you have a proper ending, a new equilibrium for your characters. And to say, oh, they woke up and this kidnap never happened, is a cop out. And that, I'm afraid, does mark you down for being unoriginal. The examiners also said that the best answers tend to be the shortest. Because students who write pages and pages and pages tend to have a lack of structure and control in their writing. So if you've properly planned, you've got all of your ideas banked before you go into the exam hall, and you leave enough time to check your answer, hopefully you haven't written reams and reams. So yeah, make sure that your story is concise. And yeah, don't use overly complex vocab for the hell of it. If you happen to know a posh word or so, and you watch Countdown and you know lots of polysyllabic words, that's great. Don't shoehorn them in just to show that you've got a good vocabulary, because you'll again be marked down on that. And yeah, they all want an enjoyable story to read. They will mark you favorably if they've enjoyed your story. So that's your paper one done with. That's all of your checklists and your key skills for paper one. We're going to go on paper two, and again, it's very formulaic, the English language exam. So it's very similar, but paper two is AO1. You just find 4 things that are true, and again, just go for the most obvious one. You don't get any extra marks for figuring out the one that's slightly ambiguous or unusual, or 90% of students will go for that answer, so you're going to go for something different. No, just go for the most obvious. You can move on to question 2, which is to summarize, and you need to select 3 similarities or differences. Make sure you make inferences as well between them, and you need to quote from both texts. A lot of students will only quote from one text. You've got to make sure that you have evidence from both. And to comment on the explicit and the implicit meanings of things. And the best terms to use when you're comparing is things like in contrast and whereas, and you need to write enough detail. So examiners want to see at least 120 words for this answer. Question 3, again, is an AO2 question. You've got to explain, comment, and analyze, again, how writer uses language. So similar from paper 1, so you need your terminology, your posh jam, semantic fields, and you use your effects. So it's very similar to the paper 1 skills that you need to implement. Discuss the connotations of words and phrases as well, particularly talking about, for instance, if there's lots of simple language or complex language, what does that say about the people and what they have to write about? Discuss how the techniques work in combination as well. So if you're finding that, for instance, there's lots of hyperbole, for instance, and lots of simple language, then perhaps that points towards some sort of sensationalism. So those terminology in combination, perhaps you can argue what the effect of that is. And lots of students forget about punctuation for some reason. Sometimes there'll be lots of exclamation marks or lots of ellipses, where you've got the 3 dots, for instance. Comment on that punctuation, or if there's some unusual grammar, anything that's unusual, it's there for a reason. So comment on it, and comment on the effect of that. And yeah, explain why the writers used certain sentence forms. I can't emphasize enough the what, how, and why. You need to focus on the why as well to get those top marks. This is the comparison question for question 4, so AO3. And again, you need to quote from both texts and compare and analyze the writer's methods. The best way to do that, again, like I was saying before, in contrast and whereas, but you also use conversely as well. Try and mix them up a little bit. Lots of students, particularly at the sort of B level, will just keep saying however, or just in contrast, they'll use the same thing. And likewise, if you're looking at similarities, likewise, equally. Make sure you vary them. Comment on the structure, if that's relevant as well as the tone. Think about how the writer feels or thinks. So kind of get into their brain through the language. You sort of semi-psychoanalyze them about why they think that. And so comment on their viewpoints, for instance. If you're finding that actually their viewpoint is very conservative, that's worth commenting on. And it might be, again, if in combination, if they're using lots of formal language, if they're using some sort of old-fashioned or traditional grammar or punctuation even, then perhaps say that contributes to their viewpoints being very traditional and conservative. Figurative language and language features, make sure you analyze those as well. Things like alliteration, onomatopoeia, juxtaposition, metaphor, personification. A lot of this actually from your literature exam is relevant. Don't get overly literary with it, but if you've already got a table for all of your methods, literary methods, make sure you've got that in your language revision as well, because you are going to need to recycle those terms. Now, part B, paper 2, this is where you've got to write a persuasive answer. And a lot of students don't really get taught how to write persuasively. The best way, I think, is to remember there are 3 ways of being persuasive, either emotional, logical, or authoritative. And again, there's a whole masterclass online available, and there's video tuitions on that, but I think it's really worth watching that, because again, this part B of paper 2 is worth 25% of your whole English language GCSE grade. So make sure you do it properly and you give it the revision it needs. Stick to the topic, not stick with the topic, stick with the topic in question as well. That's a key thing that the examiners were drilling into me. And to make sure that you answer in the correct format. So if it's a letter or article or speech, firstly, make sure you don't write the wrong one. If it asks for a letter, don't write a speech, but also make it lay out on the page, make it look like a letter. You don't necessarily have to write the address and everything. If it says to start with dear ... you don't need to, but make sure it's laid out looking like a letter, or like an article. Write a headline that looks bigger than the rest of it. Make sure it looks on the page like the format it's supposed to be in. Also match your tone as well. Again, examiners found that a lot of the time it's written sometimes far too formally. You'd think it's the opposite, that students might be a bit too informal, but actually sometimes it's the opposite. So for instance, if it's a speech to your school peers in an assembly, or if it's to write an online magazine for teenagers, for instance, write it in informal language. Make sure you match it. Likewise, if it's a letter to an authority figure, that needs to be very formal. So make sure that actually you go into the exam prepared to vary your writing style. You need to be flexible in this part of the exam. The other thing is to start and end with a powerful sentence. So as soon as your examiner looks at your answer, they can read the first sentence and they know exactly where you stand on this. You can even be a bit playful with it. And without going over the top, you can start, for instance, your letter with, I'm outraged by ... or I read your piece last week and I was absolutely furious, or something, without getting too hyperbolic about it. Make sure you start with a sentence. A lot of students will, because it's an exam, they try to write a bit like a bit sort of wishy-washy, and you don't really know where they stand, and they want to show off their writing style and the fact that they can be very formal, but actually the reason they're writing in the first place, a letter, for instance, gets lost. So make sure you start and end with a powerful sentence, again, to entertain the examiner as well. Again, they're going to read lots of boring answers, so make sure yours is enjoyable to read. Address the counter argument. Now, I'd do that first, actually. I would address counter arguments first and get it out of the way, get it over and done with, and sort of take it apart. So if you know that the core counter arguments, what you're writing about, then address that first, I would say. It's much more persuasive. Revise your persuasive techniques, things like repetition or rule of three. Make sure you have that on a revision card so you know your persuasive techniques. And as I was saying before, the emotional, logical, and authoritative methods of persuasion. Definitely worth watching the tutorials on the website for those. There's even Latin terms if you want to remember those. Ethos, logos, and pathos. Really important to really know what an emotional versus a logical argument looks like. Also for part A of the exam, if you're finding that a writer is actually focusing too much on an emotional language and is almost sort of emotionally blackmailing, you can talk about that and analyze about how effective or ineffective that is. That also means when you're writing to be persuasive, you're in control. You know that, right, I've written an emotional paragraph now. I've said why, for instance, school uniform is a real sort of burdensome and causes stress and anxiety, but actually I need a logical method now, or I need an authoritative method. The best authoritative method, you're not expected to be an expert in something, but that's where you can have your first person experience, and that can be really important. So examiners for top grade answers, they'll want to see a personal anecdote or an opinion. But if you can actually say, from my experience, that also gives you an authoritative method for your argument as well. So for instance, if it is about school or about travel, you can't really argue with someone's own experience. So if you've got personal experience of it, you can make something up, of course, that adds authority to it, but try and have it as a personal anecdote. Bring yourself into the exam. Make sure you separate paragraphs as well. Make sure that your letter or speech or whatever is clearly formatted and laid out properly. And make sure each paragraph points back to the question to support your argument. Sometimes you might go a bit off tangent, that's fine. Bring the next paragraph back to the question. The other thing is to vary your sentence lengths as well, and that can be for effect. So you can have a very short sentence with an exclamation mark. You just make sure you vary them, but make sure you do have some compound and complex sentences. Show that you can write as a sophisticated student. Again, make sure you spend that 5 minutes at the end to check your answer. You're not going to run out of time in your exam because you're going to revise all of the timings that I've told you about today. So you're not going to run out of time, but you are going to use that 5 minutes to correct all of your spelling mistakes. Because again, if there are even 3 or 4, particularly 4, but 3 spelling mistakes, you might drop a band. And again, because this part B is worth 25% of your English language exam, I'll keep drumming that into you to terrify you, 25% of your whole qualification, you do not want to get marked down for silly spelling mistakes. So use that 5 minutes. You might also want to then put in some more punctuations as well as you're marking it, as you're checking it rather. You might want to put in a semicolon and dashes to vary that punctuation, because again, that shows that you're a sophisticated writer and that you actually know how to use a semicolon. And again, be ambitious with your vocabulary, but not for the sake of it. The other thing is this is all from the examiner's focus group that I hosted, and these are some of their top tips. They want you to use humor for one. They want to find your answer enjoyable to read. So use humor, but only if it's effective. Don't just try to write a stand-up speech at that point. Just use humor for effect. And again, take time to plan. Spend that 10 minutes or so planning properly what your points are. And a plan does not look like, and I have seen exam papers where it says point 1, point 2, point 3, and that apparently is their plan. No, it's not. You need to write what your point is for your argument. So P1 equals, and then what your point is. So make sure that your plan is like that, 3 or 4 bullet points long. Also, it's going to help the examiner navigate your answer as well. They can look at a glance what your key arguments are. And so your examiner is going to look for, this is what the examiner said verbatim, the main points followed by details and development. So the development is where you can get that 9 or A star. It's the fact that if you're going to make a persuasive point, and if you give some detail about it, go on, go that extra mile. And that might be, the extra mile might be your authoritative method behind that. So it might be that, you know, from my own personal experience, ... Just something like that. It develops your point and adds some gravitas to it. And make sure you use your own words. This again was new to me, but examiners were saying that a lot of students tend to sort of cherry pick some good phrases from the extracts in this paper and then recycle it as part of their own answer. And they lose marks for that. So you can paraphrase, don't paraphrase too much, but just try and use your own words for your argument. And that's their top tips for part B. So that's covered everything I wanted to show. I know it's a real whistle-stop overview of all the skills and the timings that you're going to need, but there are individual tutorials on the website. So what's next for your revision is you go on to Pass My English. Everything is free, and it will be for at least another 6 months. If you sign up now, you'll always have free access. And there's tutorials on every single part that I've spoken about. So for instance, on the narrative writing, there are videos on how to create believable characters and settings and objects. Once you've done the tutorials, put it into practice with the practice papers. At the moment, there's a practice paper for each paper, and there will be over the next 3 weeks, more practice papers and mark schemes added. And you can find, there's a forum, you can find a study buddy as well, and you can mark each other's work. So what I'm trying to do is create with examiners a student-friendly mark scheme, so you can mark your own answers with confidence, but you might find it easier to study, to mark someone else's. So you can find someone of a similar grade to you if you like on the forum, and you can mark each other's work. And hopefully you can attend more masterclasses. As I say, I'm doing one on narrative writing next week and one on persuasive writing. And so if you go to those, that's 50%. If you can just focus on those 2 parts of the exam, that's half of your grade sorted pretty much. So that's the aim. Before we finish, does anyone have any questions about the 2 papers or anything that we've gone over today?
I had a question basically. Hi
Yeah.
there. Thank you. It was really informative. Thanks a lot.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Basically, yeah, my daughter is not giving GCSE this year or next year. It is basically, she will be going to year 8. But the whole reason I came on today's session was to get a understanding myself. Because we are quite new to the whole thing of GCSE with the AQA board. No, this was really helpful. My question is, in terms of, you mentioned about particularly the part A for both paper 1 and paper 2. Is there any resources apart from Pass My English where we could have some modeled answers or papers mark scheme basically? Is there any websites we could go on to?
Yeah, sure. There's lots. There's Mr. Bruff is quite good, I think. I think lots of people will have heard of Mr. Bruff. He does practice papers and mark schemes as well, and model answers. So yeah, there are resources around. What I will do is I'll try and have on my website, actually, I'll try to have other resources. So there'll be links. I think that's a very good idea that you've given me. Thank you. I'll put something on the website. So there are some other resources to things. But what I'm hoping to achieve over the next few weeks is so that you won't need to do that, obviously, is that there's enough on there, so that there's enough model answers on there. So you can compare what, for instance, a B grade answer looks like compared to an A star answer. So that will be on there in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, that would be really helpful. Yes. Did you say Mr. Graff?
Mr. Bruff with a B. Mr. Bruff.
Oh, Bruff. B-R-A-P-H.
B-R-U-F-F. He's very good.
Okay, no, yeah.
And also there's something called StudyTube as well. That's it, yeah. And there's something called StudyTube as well on YouTube, where it's lots of previous GCSE students giving their top tips. That can be very useful as well. So StudyTube I'd recommend as well.
Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect. Right. Now I'll go onto the website, Pass My English. I mean, it looks really interesting. And yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Does anyone else have any questions? No, if we don't, then you all have my email address if you want to ask me anything. As I was saying, there are going to be more practice papers, mark schemes, and model answers uploaded on the website over the next few weeks. What I'm hoping for is mid-August to have a complete set on there. There are a complete set of video tutorials, but to have a complete set of resources on there for people who are either going to be sitting their exam in the autumn who weren't able to do it this year, but also people going into year 11 this year as well, so they can start the term with lots of new skills. Hopefully you found today useful. I'll send our feedback, so if there's anything else that I can improve on or do differently that you want to see for the next time, then I'd love to hear that. And meanwhile, if you've got any other ideas or suggestions for content for the site, just let me know. We're going to be adding to the site. I've got about 20 editors at the moment working on content, so now's the best time. If you've got an idea for content for the site, just let me know. But otherwise, thanks so much for coming today, and I hope you'll join me on